everybody, and welcome to episode number 10 of Reappropriate, the podcast. My name is Jen, and I am the blogger at reappropriate.co, and I'm also on Twitter at Reappropriate. And today I'm very excited to have my favorite guest on, James Lamb, who's tweeting at @SnoopyJenkins. Today we're going to be talking about an issue that really started out as sort of a dinner time conversation for the two of us, which was mismatch theory. So before I begin and introduce James, I want to remind all the viewers that are watching that if you happen to be streaming this, you can participate in the conversation a couple of different ways. First of all, you can tweet me at @Reappropriate, and I can see your tweets as we are recording, and I will attempt to respond to you on air. Another way that you can interact with me and James is through using the question and answer app on the Google Hangout. And so when you type in your questions, we will see them and try to respond to them. So, as I mentioned, today I have my very favorite guest, James Lamb. And James, if you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you.
How you doing? My name is James Lamb. I blog at snoopyjenkins.wordpress.com. Most of the pieces up there have been about comic books, but I have lots of other interests, mostly having to do with politics, and I'm eager to have a conversation tonight about mismatch theory and affirmative action. So I spent recently a lot of time on a website none of you should ever go to, bigwowo.com, and in discussing affirmative action, mismatch theory, and the like with these people, I realized that I needed to spend some time online with you, Jen, setting the record straight about what affirmative action actually does. So that's why we're talking tonight.
Well, I think it's really interesting that we have to have this conversation, and part of the reason I've actually kind of wanted to have this podcast is because mismatch theory is very interesting. It's a kind of a sort of fringe science that has been invoked by opponents of affirmative action for the last 5 or 10 years, and yet there's almost no popular conversation about what mismatch theory is and why it's, well, in essence, wrong, which is what we're going to learn through the course of this podcast. And yet it's cited virtually all the time by opponents of affirmative action. So, for example, Clarence Thomas cited it in some of his conversation about affirmative action. I think he wrote an article where he cited mismatch theory in relation to some of the Supreme Court cases on affirmative action. In a recent op-ed in the LA Times, written by, let me see what his name was, Yunlei Yang, of the Silicon Valley something.
Chinese Association.
The Silicon Valley Chinese Association. Thank you. He also cites mismatch theory. He writes, last but not least, it's highly questionable that affirmative action helps blacks and other minorities, which the poll takes as given. And he's talking about Karthik Ramakrishnan's poll, which recently showed about 2/3 of support for affirmative action among Asian Americans. So Yunlei Yang writes, there is a famous book written by UCLA law professor Richard Sander and journalist Stuart Taylor, and the title says it all, Mismatch, How Affirmative Action Hurts Students. It's intended to help, and why universities won't admit it. And finally, another reason I wanted to talk about mismatch theory is because it comes up again in yet another opponent of affirmative action, which is the 80-20 PAC. They recently sent out an email also in response to Dr. Ramakrishnan's work, where they also cited mismatch theory. So clearly this is something that is a major talking point for opponents of affirmative action. Yet I think that for those of us who are on the more pro-affirmative action side, we really are scratching our heads and wondering what this really is. And I know, so James, you and I were talking about this over dinner time, and we both decided to go back and research mismatch theory and find out what it was really all about. So since you've done this a little bit more recently than I have, I'm wondering if maybe you want to give the elevator speech on what mismatch theory argues.
Okay, well, elevator speech. Mismatch theory, to my knowledge, is essentially the notion that affirmative action harms young African-American students, especially those going into higher education environments, undergraduate schools, or selective colleges and universities, really, or selective graduate programs like law school or medical school, by allowing college administrators and admissions personnel to select the somewhat talented but not really African-American students, people who are scoring well but not as well as their Asian and white counterparts on standardized tests. So they normally have lower test scores in standardized tests than you'll find in other groups. The reason they're going after these students is in order to fill diversity and make these selective colleges and universities a place where people can find any instruction in any study, no matter who they are. The important point, though, is that by draining the barely able to compete, each lower tier school has to also drain whomever's left. So a black kid with a 1400 on the SAT ends up going to a really nice, like, upper level selective college and university. Well, all the kids with the 1200s, when they apply, end up going to the next rung down, and so on and so forth. So you have what's called a mismatch, where these students, while somewhat intelligent, aren't quite able to keep up with their white and Asian peers in the coursework taught in selective colleges and universities because of their mismatch with a student body and therefore harder coursework, etc., in these selective colleges and universities. So they're more likely to fail out. They're more likely to have academic trouble. They're more likely to perform at a grade level or so lower than their peers, become frustrated, and not complete the courses of study that they are trying to complete. Or if they do complete them, they end up going off into the workforce with the stigma of their mismatch and their lower scores attached to them, and end up getting worse outcomes, worse paying jobs. It's just all a barrel of horrible for them. That, in essence, is mismatch theory.
So basically, mismatch theory is arguing, in a nutshell, that elite universities are, through affirmative action, letting in students into a school that is too hard for them, quote unquote, and that this is actually hurting the students by discouraging them and causing them to fail out, and so they would be better off in schools that are less stringent or less hard. So part of my issue with the mismatch theory is that it purports to demonstrate this based on actual science, and that is the book that Yang is citing by Richard Saunders about mismatch theory, how universities, or how affirmative action is supposedly treating affirmative action candidates. And I know that one of the things that was actually a little bit surprising to me, and I don't know if it was surprising to you, James, as we read into this, is how completely empty the science on mismatch theory actually is. I know that for myself, I listened to an NPR Intelligence Squared debate, which really was the inspiration for this podcast, where I listened to Richard Saunders sort of present his evidence when it came to mismatch theory. And even immediately off the top, it just seems completely scientifically baseless. So, for example, he was discussing a more recent study that he had done that was not peer-reviewed and not published, where he, in essence, was looking at students that had been given what he termed strong racial preference through the admissions process and comparing them to students that hadn't been. And he was doing this based on SAT score, as far as I understand. But he was comparing students that had scored extremely poorly on the SAT compared to students that had performed extremely well, and then noting that they were of different races, and saying that therefore the student who performed extremely poorly must have gotten in only because of a strong racial preference through affirmative action, and then pointing out how this student may not have performed nearly as well on their first year courses. The problem of that immediately that jumped to my mind was that this doesn't really reflect how affirmative action is practiced at any college or university. So he was talking about a difference in SAT score that was about 300 to 400 points. And yet, if you look at the average SAT score, even at elite universities across the races, the largest difference that you see is about 250 to 300 points. And that's the far extremes if you compare underrepresented minorities against Asian American students, which may or may not include foreign-born students who tend to perform a little bit better on standardized testing. So you have, at the far extreme, something that only vaguely represents the scenario that he's comparing. So immediately it seemed to me that he was making a sort of a false comparison that was hard to extrapolate to the real world. And then I remember that in the debate, he actually said that the comparison he made was so broad that he couldn't actually make any predictions when it came to more modest or moderate influences of race on the college admissions process. That might be akin to more than like 50 or 100 points, which is much more similar to how affirmative action, race-conscious affirmative action, is practiced in colleges and universities. So that was my first issue with mismatch theory. But then as we read deeper, and James in particular, you read deeper, it seems as if there's almost no scientific consensus that supports Richard Saunders beyond just this one issue with this one study that I found out about. So I know you've been reading about this last week. Do you want to sort of give us the highlights as to how scientifically baseless this really is?
So starting off, I want to say, in short, mismatch theory is essentially the intelligent design of anti-affirmative action thinking. It's really about ideology dressed up in scientifically plausible arguments. The problem always, though, has to do not just with the assumptions made in order to deliver the argument on mismatch theory, but also the methodology used to describe it. Richard Sander, not Saunders, his
British pronunciation.
Argument, sorry. His first argument about this was in a law school review article in, I want to say 2003, 2004, something around that area. And the important point here is that article has been ripped apart so many different times by so many different authors, it was actually difficult to distill it all into one, easily digestible way for you. It's been called unpersuasive, difficult, unscientific. There's an entire list here, actually.
I mean, I read a sort of review article, I think it was in Salon, about how wrong mismatch theory was, and it was actually very shocking how there's virtually no reputable scientist who not only agrees with Sanders or Saunders, however you want to say his name. I'll say Saunders because I'm Canadian.
There's no S. It's Richard Sander.
Fine, Sander. It was amazing to me how you couldn't even just find reputable scientists who agreed with him. It was more like you couldn't find reputable scientists who could replicate his data, and that is even more alarming.
So one thing that's really important to recognize is that there's been several years in between his first arguments on the subject and today. So there have been other review articles and other people doing this work who have not necessarily agreed with him as much as I think he would like to say, but who have also taken up the notion of mismatch theory and provided studies that purport to agree with it. The Intelligence Squared US debate that we're both referencing, and I have quotes from later, spends a lot of time trying to make that case to the audience that yes, they came after his early works on the subject, but since then there's been a lot of other peer-reviewed data on the subject which they believe agrees with Richard Sanders' overall point. That being said, on his early and most honest distillation of this theory, it's been called erroneous in both interpretation and data and the conclusions, that Sander muddied the waters, that it was unreliable, that he misapplied basic principles, that no plausible interpretation of the data would lead to Sanders' results, and so on and so forth. And the reason being, there's a lot of qualitative critiques of his work, where basically the regression analysis that he uses does not allow for the kind of conclusions he wants to make from the data. Most of those critiques, and again, it might be best for the viewer to get a chance to look at some of these critiques directly. A lot of it's incredibly dense, so what we're going to do, I'm going to offer all of this stuff up to reappropriate.co to give a listing on the website so you can go back and read this on your own time. But
right, and for all the viewers who are watching, this podcast will go hand in hand with an actual literature review, and so if you're looking for more facts and specific examples, I do plan on writing up what James has done for us.
But there are a couple of points. For example, there's one particular law review article from a guy, Chambers, and a few others, points out that now I'm doing it, that Professor Sander uses two different law review studies of law students in order to make his points on mismatch. For example, he uses a national survey of law school performance for some of his analyses and the Law School Admission Council National Longitudinal Bar Passage Study, or BPS, for other analyses. But the problem with that is that he doesn't keep the data consistent. So when later on when he's making various points, if you actually did keep the data consistent, it would say essentially the exact opposite of what he wants to say. But all of this is kind of not the point. The important point with mismatch theory is that it tries to argue that the African American student going into a selective college or university in undergrad or into a selective graduate program is so hampered by whatever is going on in the past. Poor preparation, simply being black on Tuesday, whatever you can think of, that they're scoring worse than than other students, particularly white and Asian students. But I digress. Because they score worse, and because you can tell this through standardized test scores like the LSAT, like the SAT, and so on, trying to bring them into the student bodies in selective colleges or universities will only hurt them, because these students will not only start off unprepared and therefore further back than their white and Asian peers, but will stay there no matter what influences, input, knowledge, teaching skill, what have you, through the procedure of going through school. So if you start off with a 1200 in your SAT and the whites and Asians in your school have like 1400s or like 1500s or a perfect score, you're always going to be behind them. Not just you start off that way, you will end up that way later. That notion, that determinism about the effectiveness of any selective college or university education is an assumption made by Saunders, by mismatch theory, that I believe is an unfounded one. And I think that's a good place to start. I think if we start with some of the assumptions made, we can get into a real discussion about the particulars.
Right. I mean, I started this this podcast with the topic, is mismatch theory just plain wrong, or is it both wrong and racist? And that was sort of the question I was hoping we would answer by the end of tonight. Because I think your analogy between mismatch theory being for the affirmative action opponents being identical to what intelligent design is for the anti-evolutionists is extremely apt. Or, the climate change denialists are for the climate change denialists. Like, you've got a very small fringe body of literature that argues, perhaps with shoddy science, one thing, and then the vast majority of other scientists who do this work, who are offering different data, are having a hard time replicating the data. And basically, if there is going to be a scientific consensus, the scientific consensus is that mismatch theory is just plain wrong. So that's almost settled. I do think that it's important that those of us that are not doing this kind of scientific research are able to bring those data out towards the more mainstream. I think, it's sort of, like I said, surprising to me that opponents of affirmative action can continue to cite a theory that is so largely scientifically baseless. And, you've read the articles, I've read some of the articles. We can just go down a list of how many problems there are with mismatch theory, just from a scientific perspective. And like I said, when I get a chance to, I will be writing a literature review that will give the best evidence as to why mismatch theory is wrong from the people who do that and translate it for us. But more to the point, I think you're right that challenging the underlying assumptions about mismatch theory is really important. One of the things that Saunders' work brought out to me in the NPR Intelligence Squared debate was the basic assumption within the design of his original experiment when it looked at law students or undergraduate students and tried to compare two groups where he decided one had undergone strict racial or strong racial preference over another. That, by definition, asserts that the strong racial preference group must be the African American with the low SAT score or LSAT score, who's coming in and only coming in and being admitted because of some sort of unspoken racial quota or lowering of standards. So you have to be coming in with an existing extremely color-coded and biased perspective to design this experiment in the first place, because you're ignoring all of the other factors that might create artifacts within the way that you would analyze that data set. You're ignoring, for example, legacies, athletic scholarships, the simple fact that you're not comparing black and white students of similar standardized test scores, etc. So, when you were going through the literature, what were some of the assumptions that jumped out at you?
Well, so one assumption is exactly that, the strength of an actual racial preference and how that affects the admission process. Starting there. Professor Sanders' work does not really allow us to say that there is, he's ignoring necessarily legacy admissions or athletic scholarships. I don't believe he ignores that stuff. I think people who are using his work to justify their own arguments against affirmative action oftentimes ignore those other types of non-academic reasoning for allowing a student into a college or university. Professor Sander does not necessarily do that. Secondly, it's also pretty clear that the strength of the preference has been quantified in a way that is highly dubious. When Gail Harriet, a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, was arguing the side in favor of the motion that affirmative action had essentially outlived its usefulness in the intelligence squared debate that you're speaking about, she and Professor Sander talked about preferences as a large, huge, like supremely influential thing. The idea that a black student comes in with a highly reduced score in comparison to the white and Asian counterparts. For example, just off the top of the head in some respects, but the idea of there not just being like a 50-point boost on an SAT to compare where the black student is getting into the school and to like the white student, the Asian student, but more like several hundred points. So Byron Wong from BigWoWo.com, a noted affirmative action opponent, often says, using his understanding of Professor Sanders' work, that the Asian student gets in with a 1550 or gets rejected from the school with a 1550 on the SAT, while the black student gets in with an 1100 on the SAT. Now, there are reasons that have already been put out on your site as to why that's not entirely correct.
Can I jump in and say why that's not right? Can I please?
No, because before you do that, what's important here is that the size of the racial preference is often used as a reason that to give an independent listener a reason to be against affirmative action. That it's not some sort of small thing. It's a incredibly influential thing. That basically the black student wouldn't make it into the school without ignoring or somehow boosting his SAT score with the racial preference work. So that's one assumption made by the mismatch theory work that I've read about and is brought up oftentimes in the critiques, that if you are going to make that kind of claim, you have to have evidence to back it up. And you're about to tell us why it doesn't work.
Okay, well, I'm going to jump in and talk about that 1550 versus 1100 thing, because I think you're right that people who are quoting mismatch theory assume that Saunders' sort of setup, where it's about a 300 to 400 point difference in racial in the average SAT score serving as your proxy for strong racial preference, reflects the actual mean scores of these different groups, which is just a fundamental misunderstanding, not even of just mismatch theory, but what Saunders is actually talking about. He never argues this. So, and I think that one of the take-home themes we're going to be ending up with tonight is that I don't think supporters or opponents of mismatch theory are actually reading any of this literature, and you see it often miscited. So that was Saunders' setup, and it does not reflect the actual mean. So what the folks at Byron's site are really talking about are this 1500 or 1550 SAT score for Asian Americans at elite universities versus a supposed 1100 for African Americans. But that is not the mean SAT score for freshmen going into, let's say, Harvard or whatever. It doesn't even reflect real scores. What that comes from is the notorious Thomas Espenshade data, which was using, again, a regression model to try and predict the quote-unquote relative difficulty of getting into some of these elite universities translated into an SAT score. There is, I argue, a great deal of problem with the way that he pooled his data in order to generate this regression model, but suffice it to say, this does not represent the mean difference in scores between black students and Asian students, or black students and white students, or however you want to put this. This is the product of a regression model. And if you look at the actual average SAT score going into universities across the board, so nationally, or even if you look at the SAT scores of those entering into elite universities and colleges, and those data are published on the internet and available in a 30-second Google search, you'll find that, like I said earlier, the maximum difference between racial groups is approximately 200 points. And if you're looking at black and white comparisons, which is what Thomas Espenshade is comparing, and more specifically what Richard Saunders is comparing, you'll see that the white-black difference is closer to 50 or 100 points. So this 300 to 400 point score, I think you're absolutely right, James. It's used to try and argue that affirmative action produces a huge lowering of standards. But the assumptions there are, first, that regression models are actually being used, or are actual averages, which they're not. They're essentially made-up numbers. And two, they're arguing that these made-up numbers, that the SAT scores are an actual measure of merit. And there's plenty of counter-arguing data to suggest that even if there were some small gap in SAT scores, at the gap that we're talking about, 50 to 100 points, or even 100 to 200 points, the SAT scores, or standardized tests in general, are such poor predictors of performance and merit that that gap is largely meaningless. And so between those two things, it just drives me up the wall when people cite a made-up number about SAT score differences and then use that to argue that affirmative action lowers standards for applicants of one race versus another.
So here's why I think all of that is really important. The difficulty in one of the general critiques of Professor Sander was that his work did not allow his biases time to move away from the data. That basically he changed his interpretation of the data to reflect his biases against affirmative action, as opposed to keeping his analysis essentially free of that prejudice. And there's a lot of scholarship on that particular point of it. But it's also clear here that there needs to be some context given towards why he would have promoted mismatch theory in the first place. And honestly, the professor's trying to help. He fervently believes that we will end up with more black lawyers and black doctors if you remove affirmative action and its racial preferences from the board, because of that whole issue with the cascade model. Remember how in mismatch theory the assumption is that we're basically pulling up all of the African Americans who are college bound or professional school bound into selected colleges and universities that are basically above their pay grade intellectually. Sander believes that if we stop doing that and end affirmative action, that all these people will basically flood lower tier colleges and universities, and everything will be right as it should be. They'll go to schools that are more on their skill level intellectually, and you'll end up with more African Americans in law and medicine. They'll come from lower, second, third, fifth tier school, mind you, but they'll exist and they'll be out there and they'll be lawyers and they'll pass something, etc. Now, that was probably the most interesting part of the scholarship that I read, where people took on that very notion. There's an interesting piece in the Texas Law Review from, I want to say 2014. Actually, no, there's like 2 or 3 different ones here. Yes,
you did a lot more reading than I did.
I did a lot of reading. Reviewed by William C. Kidder and Angela Willig. Still hazy after all these years, the data and theory behind mismatch. And one of the several, it's like, admittedly like 50 pages of why Richard Sander is dead wrong on everything. But the reason they had so much volume is in part because of this one point, this notion that the cascade, if you flood it back, is going to be beneficial. Here's why it doesn't make a lot of sense. Richard Sander doesn't spend a lot of time trying to understand why a particular student, any law student, would choose the school they are going to. So, say for example, you have an able young woman from the South Side of Chicago, and she wants to go to law school. Does she pick a college or university on the East Coast where she's more likely to be around people who are, somewhat like her culturally or et cetera? Or does she go to, say, Iowa law, Montana law, New Mexico law? Well, to be honest with you, she may not necessarily pick one of those schools. And if she's able to get into, say, NYU, Wagner, or Columbia, or Harvard, those spaces might have a cultural connection to her as well as a intellectual one that'll be more likely to keep her in. There's one particular factoid about this that I wanted to just make sure I said, which was, if you believe that the second and third tier school is where the African American student with, say, a 150 on the LSAT as opposed to a 175 belongs, or maybe a 145, whatever. So some huge gap, if we agree with everything that the mismatch theory is trying to tell us. Then where are those schools? Are they state schools like New Mexico law, where most of the students who are going to that school are, because it's a state school that's designed to be a place for New Mexico residents to study law? Are most of those people going to be African American? No. Given current demographics, that's not at all what's going on. Same with something like Montana law, etc. Now, are people willing to go hundreds of miles away from home where there are no one like them in order to study a particular thing? Certainly, but not too many. And those kinds of lifestyle choices are as important to every student who wants to study at a professional school, no matter who you are. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I don't think we see too many Asian Americans in something like Montana law, because I mean, who lives in Montana? And shout out to everybody who lives in Montana. Y'all are wonderful people. I'm not saying that in anything different. I'm just, let's make the point clear. Those kinds of assumptions that will all just flood into the lower tier schools, the second and third and et cetera tier schools, don't always make a lot of sense given geography, given not only the cost of those schools, being an out-of-state student. Those kind of factors also come in. And the fact that Richard Sanders spent no time whatsoever on that point, while he made the claim that his perception of ending affirmative action based on his mismatch theory made sense, was, to my mind, very, very difficult, and the kind of criticism that had a lot of resonance for me as you're reading this stuff.
I think that his theory reflects a fundamental naivete when it comes to what students are actually looking for in their schools and what goes through their minds when they're trying to make the decisions about where they're going to go, as you kind of said. I think it also speaks to sort of this what happens when you're so desperate to shoehorn your own political ideology into your science that you, in essence, confirmation bias yourself such that you eliminate all of the other things that a good scientist would normally think about that would complicate your analysis of the data. So, for example, thinking about things like when a student might go to a second-tier school, the mitigating factors that might complicate his or her choice to going to, say, Montana, and sorry to pick on Montana, guys, going to Montana as opposed to wanting to go to Harvard. Or, if you just look at the UC system, which, again, I think is a wonderful laboratory for studying virtually all affirmative action issues, you have, the quote-unquote better UC schools versus the less good UC schools, quote-unquote. And there you can also see, if a student doesn't get into the best of the best in the UC system, are they naturally going to want to go to one of the second-tier UC schools, or are there other concerns like perhaps geography or tuition, or just the whether or not the availability of majors are the same? So there's a lot of things that one has to think about, and it's not just about trying to get into the best school that matches your skill set. Students just take a lot of other considerations in when it comes to considering schools. I bring this all up because I think the other weakness in Saunders' work is that he forgets the importance of those factors in establishing student success within the first year, which is his output, which is his endpoint when it comes to studying the effect of mismatch or the supposed effective mismatch. He uses a variety of endpoints, but they all basically boil down to first-year college success. Does the student pass his or her first year courses? Does the student pass the bar if he's studying law school? Does the student drop out of school? These are all things that he studied, and to varying degrees of mathematical stringency, does he actually demonstrate this? But I remember that one of my issues with his work was that he seemed to argue that college environment was important in arguing that college environment was not important. So in one of his endpoints, he showed that I believe it was law school students were not passing the bar if they did less well on the LSATs. And he's tried to argue that it was African American students who performed less well on the LSATs who were let into these much more difficult schools who were then having a good time passing the bar. But what he failed to take into account was that these elite schools that he was studying were also schools where African American students were in the minority, where they were potentially not receiving the same kind of supportive academic environment and mentorship that students that were not minority were receiving at the same campus in the same schools. And there's a huge body of literature, specifically within the UC systems as well as elsewhere, that shows that the kind of campus environment, even just the perception of tolerance, as well as the actual availability of mentorship programs that cater to the broader range of students, have a meaningful impact on student success. And in fact, I would argue that it's perhaps been shown that there's more of an impact of that kind of campus environment issue than say your performance on the standardized tests within the small window that we talk about in regards to college admissions, 50 to 100, maybe at most 150 points. So I think that those are all very interesting issues when it comes to Saunders' work, these basic artifacts that he simply ignores. So he argues that college environment is important when it suits him, and yet he argues that it's unimportant when it doesn't suit him.
One of the things that I think is brought up by Richard Sander and people who are following him is that you have to believe kind of a double consciousness stuff like that in order to really buy the argument. I think what you're bringing up is actually really interesting. In particular, can you actually elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I want to make sure that point is actually hit on the head. But Richard Sander is basically arguing that culture matters when it wants to. I mean,
yeah. He's arguing that college environment is important when it comes to the success of a student, and that's the fundamental basis of his argument about the cascade theory, that the elite universities are too hard for the student, and so it's a fundamental mismatch of the mediocre student in the school that is simply too competitive or too challenging for him or her. Yet he argues that based on an analysis of data that ignores the impact of college environment on his outcomes. He ignores whether or not students had access to mentorship, whether or not students had access to appropriate scholarships, whether they had access to childcare. These are all issues of campus environment that have nothing to do with race and racial preferences. And he simply just throws that all away to argue that the elite university is essentially a hostile environment to these strong racial preference students, but then argues that, so he ignores campus environments so that he can then make the argument that when they move to the second-tier school, that school is going to be more conducive environmentally to that student. So I feel like, again, he's picking and choosing where campus environment is important, and specifically campus environment seems to be completely unimportant when it comes to actually generating his data or supporting his argument with science.
So that's a great segue into some information from another piece that I had a chance to read. It's called The Case for Black Inferiority: What Must Be True If Professor Sander is Right? A response to his law review article, A Systemic Analysis of Affirmative Action in American Law Schools. This is from Beverly I. Moran. It's another one of those articles that is going to be available on the site later. She spent some time with the overall qualitative dismissal of his original article, and then goes into a section. I'm going to read a short quote from this, but I think it's a great distillation of much of what we're talking about. Truth number one: the best blacks are simply not as qualified as the best whites. Professor Sanders' article is based entirely on combining three ideas. First, that all law schools give great weight to undergraduate grade point averages and an LSAT score in selecting their entering class, and that the great majority of law schools combine LSAT and UGPA into a single index that provides for easy comparison of candidates. Second, that the index created by combining undergraduate grade point average and LSAT score is not culturally biased and is a remarkably powerful predictor of both law school grades and bar exam performance. Indeed, Sander believes that it is appropriate to regard this index, without more, as a valid and neutral mechanism for determining who should attend law school and which law school they should attend. Further, although it might be appropriate to consider other factors, for example, economic class, these other factors should not be given so much weight that they allow for the admission of students who do not have the requisite LSAT/UGPA, undergraduate grade point average, index for that particular school. So again, just as my little aside here, what we're talking about is Sander and his interest in using qualitative numbers that can be defined through systemic work, standardized testing, and grade point average from undergraduate colleges and universities. Moving on. Finally, Professor Sander's article asserts that even at the most demanding law schools, the average black student has a much lower index than the average white student. These 3 points taken together mean that schools can use the index scores in order to identify those black students with the best chance of graduating and passing the bar, and that within any given school, the best black students have, almost without exception, less ability than both the best white students and the very good white students. The reason I read that entire quote is that this is the entire point of mismatch theory. In order to believe Richard Sander, in order to believe the anti-affirmative action people like Yunlei Yang from the Silicon Valley Chinese Association, who cited this in his opposition to a recent affirmative action
well, he cited the title. I'm not certain that he read it.
Maybe not, but he's invoking this kind of work, and I think it's important to remember what they are trying to tell us all is that black people are naturally stupider than the rest of the population. Mm-hmm. That's the problem with it. If you believe mismatch theory, what you are saying is that by and large, because we have an LSAT, because we have the SAT, because we have the GMAT, because we have these standardized tests that we believe are, or we're telling ourselves are completely objective measures, because there are undergraduate grade point averages that people gain through their undergraduate work, what we know is that if you don't have the same kind of numbers as the best white students or the best Asian students, you're literally not as smart and you don't deserve to compete with them.
I want to jump in because this is a great chance for me to bring in one of the comments that we received while we've been airing. Eric Y. shared this on the Google Plus page that we're using to record right now, and he writes, mismatch theory is not wrong and racist. If, presumably, if anyone can't get numbers and or show ability, then you should not be admitted to higher learning. And I think that's exactly what you said in, 2 sentences or less, which is the argument, again, that mismatch theory is correct if one assumes that standardized tests and standardized tests alone are an objective measure of quality and merit. And therefore, if you take a look at demographic studies that show a trend for some students and applicants of certain races or even economic backgrounds or geographic locations are performing less well than other students, that this must mean that they are objectively less qualified. They are either stupider or less well prepared. And it can honestly be take your pick how you want to argue the insufficiency of the affirmative action student who supposedly is having their standards lowered to get in. And frankly, I'm not interested in parsing the difference because as far as I'm concerned, that's a largely meaningless distinction, whether or not you're arguing that they're actually stupider or less well prepared. The bottom line is that whether you're arguing either of those 2 points, you're fundamentally basing your argument on the assumption that a standardized test is the best and only way to judge the qualities of an applicant. And I think that this gets right down to the nut of why I support affirmative action, and more specifically why I support affirmative action as a larger facet of my support of holistic review, which is simply to say that I think the only reason we place so much emphasis on these qualitative numbers is because they're quantitative. actually. Because numbers allow one to rank someone, we make the assumption that because we can rank, therefore we should rank, therefore the ranking is meaningful. And we do that even when, like I said earlier in the podcast, we have ample data showing such poor predictive value of standardized tests that within the range of a standardized test score that we're talking about when it comes to any elite university or college, the differences in test scores are meaningless. You can absolutely argue that the difference between a 1600 and a 900 on a 1600-point scale produces a meaningful predictive difference when it comes to college admissions. But when it comes to small ranges that we're talking about at elite universities, such as the university that we went to, the difference between a 1200, a 1300, and a 1400 is largely meaningless, and it's definitely meaningless even when you ask the folks who administer the exam. They argue themselves on their website that the SAT scores, if you're looking at undergraduate, is absolutely not intended to be a measure of merit. It's only intended to offer some idea of whether or not this student is prepared enough for first-year college. But it doesn't even really, they don't even really argue it does that. It's just a way to offer some data on the applicant. And I don't think that it should be taken as the be-all and end-all. And yet, as we've talked about when it comes to mismatch theory and assumptions, I think the fundamental issue with all the scientists who are engaging in mismatch theory is that they come at it from the basic assumption that because we can rank standardized tests, therefore standardized tests is our best input of student quality.
So on those points, I think it's also clear, and thank you for the comment from Eric, you say?
Eric, yeah.
Because it gets at the heart of why I think people of color, some people of color, have embraced mismatch theory as a way to argue against affirmative action. One of the reasons we started talking about this was because of a conversation that we were having sort of off and on a couple different sites, and again, the discussion about Dr. Ramakrishnan's new data showing support for affirmative action among, by and large, Asian Americans, and to a pretty high degree. And there are some conservative Asian Americans who find that data improperly done. One of the biggest arguments from the Yun-Lei Yang piece in the LA Times was that Dr. Ramakrishnan's data showing a high degree of support among Asian Americans for affirmative action had to be wrong because of the methodology used, because of the kind of survey question he was asking, where he should have asked a question that was much closer to, don't you know affirmative action is absolutely 100% wrong and hurts those Negroes because they're stupid? Yeah, or maybe. Now, the reason I bring all that up is the following. I kind of have always found the notion that other people of color would be against affirmative action a little bit weird. I mean, my background is that I'm a descendant of slaves from Virginia and North Carolina. I believe white privilege exists. I believe white supremacy exists. I believe that institutional racism exists. And I believe that people of color, by and large, come under the gun from all that stuff at some point in their lives. That being said, I don't think we spend a lot of time as people of color really trying to parse the intricacies of what all that means outside of academia or high-level politics. And so we end up having interactions with race or racism that we don't have explanations for. The reason I give all that sort of background is the following. When I came across Asian Americans who were wholly against the notion of affirmative action, I wanted to learn more as to why. And what I realized after a lot of reading and study on the subject is that they're in the minority in their own group and don't freaking like it. Like, sorry. Like, well, the interesting part about Dr. Ramakrishnan's data is that it's telling us something we should already really get. Most Asian Americans live in very, very liberal states. California, New York,
New Jersey.
New Jersey, pretty like blue states. And if you live in a blue state in a cosmopolitan, sometimes highly urban or at least suburban environment, you're going to come across a lot of pretty like leftist ideas at some point in your life. You may not necessarily agree with all of them or buy into them, but the notion of cosmopolitan diversity is going to be something, especially in the last 30 years, that you're going to come across with as normal. It normalizes the idea of seeing a little bit of everyone. But when you go to a selective college or university today, you're going to see some of that diversity, but in vastly different proportions. I mean, if you happen to be an East Asian American, like 18-year-old walking into Ivy League university today, you're going to see a lot of people who might resemble you and your family. A lot of them on the street, buying bubble tea, like having ice cream, etc. And the anti-affirmative action people want to tell you that no, wait. If you don't see a proportion much higher than what you're seeing, something's wrong. There has to be somebody like you with a 1600 on the SAT who was refused entry into the selective college or university just because they were Asian. Isn't that wrong?
Except that, again, we're getting at assumptions, right? Because the problem is people who don't understand, who assume that college admissions is a pure quota system, are arguing that the pure quota system is wrong. Like, one of the things that I find most bewildering about the affirmative action debate, at least the version that we're talking about within the Asian American community, or at least in general, like online, not just Asian Americans, but that's where we've been talking about it, is that it seems to be completely uninformed by how college admissions is practiced around the country, and seems to just simply not care about the need for a duty to present science in regards to your argument, a need to inform oneself about the system that we're talking about, a need to inform oneself about the laws that we're talking about. Like, I would be, I think, more convinced by the other side of the argument, or at least a little bit more patient about it, if it didn't feel like every so often we're arguing this and we hit into this brick wall of the other side, where it's not even just about not so great rhetoric, or even, dare I say, anti-blackness, but more simply being completely uninformed about Supreme Court case laws, or being uninformed about what holistic review actually is, or being uninformed. Like, I don't understand how you can cite mismatch theory and not know what mismatch theory is, or to cite Thomas Espenshade and not know that he's offering regression model numbers, and to instead talk about them like they're actual averages of actual students going to the actual schools. Like, the fact that you can't, I asked you to give an elevator speech about mismatch theory. I am not entirely convinced that the vast majority of people who are citing mismatch theory can give you an elevator speech about what mismatch theory actually is. And that I find extremely disconcerting. I think it would be one thing if one wanted to present opinions about affirmative action, but I think that if you have the interest of citing data that supposedly back your claims, you have a responsibility to know something about that.
You do have that responsibility, but I want to try to make it clear here that the reason that doesn't happen is because of the assumptions made by the opponents of affirmative action. I think the affirmative action opponents start off with the same way that Eric did, with a notion that we have objective measures, and objective measures mean we can, without bias, without prejudice, without any kind of ill feeling towards any person, group, creed, thing, gender, what have you, make a claim to send our best and brightest to places where that best and brightest intelligence can be developed. And the problem with any kind of non-academic factor impeding that that process is that it changes what it means to be in the school. Much of Sanders' work and other opponents of affirmative action, whether Thomas Sowell, the noted economist, or even people like Clarence Thomas, or and others, most of what they have to say is that there's a stigma attached to being a person of color enrolled in a selective college and university in an era of affirmative action, that we somehow can't possibly know if we have gotten to where we've gotten because of our own ability and our own stick-to-itiveness, our own hard work, and our own intelligence, or because someone felt liberal that day. I spent a lot of time reading this work. I have, Reflections of an Affirmative Action Baby by Stephen Carter, the noted Yale law professor and author, and I've been a kid in a selective college and university in an era of affirmative action. And I can tell you that from my experience alone, You don't care. You're in the school. I don't think there's ever been a point where, as a student, I felt like, wait a minute, affirmative action exists, so maybe these whites and Asians don't think I'm smart enough. What is Oz gonna do? Like, no, like that doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen because every student who gets in, for whatever reason, has to show and prove every day. That's what
Yeah.
that is. You have to make yourself available to the work, and you sink or swim with your own merit at that point. What
Right.
the anti-affirmative action crowd are using this mismatch theory to say is that the opportunities presented to underrepresented minorities, African Americans, Latinos, and others, the Hmong, for example, should not exist because those spots are given to people who don't have the same kind of grade point averages and SAT scores or LSAT scores as whites and Asians who we already bring in very large numbers in a lot of these elite schools. I'm not sure if any notion of educational diversity could suffer such thinking.
Mhm. And also, I mean, when we get back to the basic question of tonight's podcast, which was, is mismatch theory wrong and racist? A few of the other things we haven't really touched on is we're talking about whites and Asians as if we're a monolithic Asians, as if we're a monolithic group that perform well on standardized tests. And, you know, the true crime of college admissions is this, 1 to 3% of Asian American applicants, quote unquote, who are being kept out of colleges due to some sort of unspoken Asian quota, anti-Asian quota, which is almost word for word the argument on the other side. And I would argue that, first of all, that line of argumentation is racist because it completely reinforces the model minority myth. It does not challenge the diasporic nature of the Asian American community, the multiplicity of ethnic identities within the Asian American community. It simply ignores completely the Southeast Asian American and the Pacific Islander, many of whom have socioeconomic outcome indicators that are much more in keeping with underrepresented minority groups, and who, by virtue of the lack of disaggregation of their data at the time when, for California, for example, which again I know a lot of the stuff from California, at the time when Proposition 209 was passed, disaggregated data for these Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders was simply not available. So at the time, they were being swept into however other Asian Americans were considered under race-conscious affirmative action. But since that time, they now disaggregate Asian Americans into, I'm either going to say 14 or 40 different identities. I'm going to go with 14, but it's possible it's 40. In any event, we now have a vast quantity of ethnic data when it comes to California applicants to the UC school system. And we can see that many Asian Americans, including, for example, Filipino Americans and Laotian Americans and Vietnamese Americans, are hugely underrepresented in that school. And that is still true nationally. And so to argue mismatch theory as an Asian American without acknowledging the many Asian Americans for whom the myth of the overachieving Asian American simply doesn't hold true by looking at basic numbers that, again, are also available through Google, I think is such a fundamental reinforcement of the model minority myth that it's actually offensive to me that the opponents of affirmative action have not tackled this issue. And frankly, it frustrates me. You know, you've spent some time on Byron's site. I've spent some time podcasting with Byron on this issue. I've spent time engaging with whomever I can engage with on the topic of affirmative action. And when it comes to the Asian American opponent, I really would like someone to talk about how their point of view reconciles with the Asian American and Pacific Islander community who struggles and who conceivably and likely would benefit from the return of race-conscious affirmative action with the along with disaggregated Asian American data, so that might result in the, for example, the Hmong American applicant being considered someone who might receive a small amount of preference. That's something that, that simple lack of incorporating that our basic Asian American politic into that argument, I think is really, really damning to that point of view. And then the other issue I wanted to point out, even though I know I've been talking for like 5 minutes straight, I have a really hard time with mismatch theory because I actually don't think it's a novel concept. I think it simply just brings back into the same white paternalism that we've seen for centuries now in this country, which is this idea that, African Americans just can't do right unless us, well-meaning patriarchs come in and make your choices for you, because otherwise you don't know what's good for you. And so we've got to, rig the system to take care of you because you can't take care of yourself. That white paternalism was a fundamental logic of chattel slavery. And here we see it 150 years later, where it's arguing both the inadequacies and the insufficiency of the African American student, as well as the argument that the white administrator and the white students, they all are just more talented, more prepared, more whatever euphemism you want to use, and we need to protect the African American from his own inadequacy, or the Latino, from his own inadequacies as a student. And I just have not seen how the anti-affirmative action side of the argument has managed to figure out how to reconcile that aspect of their...
To answer you directly, that's dead on. That's exactly what is in like 3 or 4 of the critiques of Professor Saunders' work. It's all about the paternalism and how you basically have white professors telling the rest of Black America, your children are simply not smart enough, go here. But one of the things that I think is really clear about this debate is that there's no way, the people on the side of being against affirmative action are not concerned with how that sounds. They are not concerned with paternalism. They are not concerned with the notion of it being considered racist by anyone. They're concerned with the idea that what for them is a meritocracy has been changed into something else. And they're concerned about it selectively on race, and within this racial selectivity, specifically against African Americans, in a way that they're not bringing up the Hmong. They're not bringing up Latino students, not really. They're bringing up Black people. Black people are the problem. And they're the problem if you're a white conservative and you're against affirmative action, or if you're an Asian American conservative against affirmative action, yeah, it's about Black people. And that becomes so selective. We don't talk about the idea that for many young men in this society today, in the last 10 years, they're going into selective colleges and universities with lower test scores than a lot of the young women they're meeting. What's true in the African American community today, and has been true for the last 15-odd years, that the college-bound students have been much more likely to be female than they have been, male, and that trend is starting to make itself known in white communities and others in very large numbers. You're starting to see a real gender disparity that we're not talking about. So when they're bringing in male students, are we giving preferences to young white men? Or I mean, we don't really know. I don't believe I've seen any information to suggest that one way or the other. But it certainly begs the question that if we're having an issue with non-academic factors being used to allow for college admissions in selected colleges and universities, why are we always talking about the race of the applicant and then therefore African Americans in particular, when we could be talking about gender, when we could be talking about a whole host of things? I mean, and again, this is less Sander and more just some of the Asian American interlocutors we've had on the subject. I've had Asian Americans online tell me that there's nothing wrong with legacy admissions because of the financial constraints of private universities, but there's something wrong with race admissions. There's nothing wrong with athletic scholarships, but there's something wrong with affirmative action, properly known. That's a pretty hard argument to make. I consider it like laughably illogical, but the reason I think those arguments are made have a lot more to do with the notion that, frankly, they don't believe Black intelligence exists. And if you're starting from that point, you're going to end with that point. It's much the same as our conversations about criminality in a society. If you believe Black people, Black men in particular, are more likely to be criminal agents, you're not going to support ideas that are about treating them like average citizens. You want to support more racial profiling. You may not think it's polite to say it in public, but it's actually easier if you don't say it in public and just vote that way, because that way you get the kind of protection you want from the society and never have to be called out for being unflinchingly racist. That is the heart of mismatch theory. It's a way to justify the same arguments about Black inferiority that we've already seen. What's interesting about the way it's being used now in the SCA 5 debate, SCA 5 debate that you've written about a lot, Jen, is that now we're starting to see this notion of what we want from America. America, the meritocracy, is working for a certain group of minority people. They're not necessarily underrepresented in colleges, in college admissions. They are underrepresented when we start talking about what you do with those college degrees. They're underrepresented in management. They're underrepresented as CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. They're underrepresented in the, I would say, in the upper levels of tenured professors in our society, but they're very much represented as people who are getting PhDs, getting master's degrees, getting professional degrees, and going to selected colleges and universities. Those people who face a bamboo ceiling but are very overrepresented when it comes to selected colleges and universities are now the ones, some of them, who are arguing against the notion that affirmative action and therefore and the diversity that it brings is a good thing. That's becoming a little bit difficult. Again, I'm not Asian American, but I would love to see what Asian Americans who are against affirmative action have to say about spending their energy and time and political interest on fighting to keep black people out of school while the white man keeps them out of the boardroom.
Well, and you know, it's very interesting. Actually, you bring up a couple of really important points. I really quickly want to make an aside. As far as I'm concerned, I think that the East Asian and South Asian American community, we are what I would consider the affirmative action success story, or one of the affirmative action success stories. Because I think another thing that our community tends to forget is that affirmative action, or at least an end to anti-Asian bias, as well as affirmative action, you know, affirmative college admissions decisions, benefited our community not even 50 years ago, 50 to 60 years ago, at a time when, you know, for example, if you take just the Chinese American, Chinese exclusion was actually a thing, where elite universities were excluding anybody but the white male student, and efforts to integrate the campus focused on Chinese foreign students as well as Chinese American students. And we have documented some of the earliest students who were invited to attend campuses at various points within the 20th century. You know, at Cornell, for example, we have pictures of the first Chinese students who were on campus and who were invited to be there, and who then created the first China Night, which is a cultural event that happened afterwards. So there was a time when policies that might now be described as race-conscious affirmative action policies were benefiting, you know, Asian American communities, and created the environment that is much more tolerant of the Asian American student that we experience today. And to now turn around and say that the diversity that we brought to the campus was not valuable, if it means bringing in students of another race or ethnicity, or to argue that those kinds of, the logic behind how our forefathers entered into this campus is now no longer valid because it would no longer benefit us, is, I think, extremely myopic, extremely short-sighted, and divisive when it comes to the project of allyship with other communities of color, and even within other Asian American communities, as we talked about different Asian Americans for whom they did not benefit from those programs because at the time there were much fewer Hmong Americans in the country. I would argue pretty much none. So, you know, to argue against affirmative action policies as an Asian American, absent of the history of our community and how we have benefited from these programs in the past, at the very least, I'd like to again see the argument be reconciled. And again, I think the take-home message for me is, you know, as you said, I've written a lot about SCA 5. I'm probably going to start writing about the New York City elite high school issue, where again affirmative action is coming up. The basic problem I have with it, again, is you have this very inconsistent, largely hard to reconcile argument where, you know, earlier we talked about Sonder caring about campus environment until he doesn't. I think that these same anti-affirmative action folks care about meritocracy until they don't. You know, meritocracy is incredibly important when it comes to asserting the Asian American who belongs or is entitled to college admission. Meritocracy is when it comes to just legacy admission, which I think makes absolutely no fucking sense whatsoever. Like, if you're going to argue against affirmative action, I think you need to also argue against legacy, because in that case, if you're arguing in favor of a purely meritocratic system, then the legacy admissions program should really bother you. But it doesn't really bother them. And then you have, again, support for affirmative action when it comes to the boardroom among some anti-affirmative action opponents. Some of them actually do argue this difference. Yunlei Yang, for example, the editorial in the LA Times that we cited at the beginning of the podcast, actually argues within in his column that he's against affirmative action when it comes to college admissions, but extremely supportive of affirmative action when it comes to the boardroom. And this key distinction for him, as he articulates within his column, is that he feels that Asian Americans are being denied access to the boardroom, whereas he feels that they're being excluded from the college campus. And so he feels that in the one sense, affirmative action is completely acceptable because his in-group is the one being excluded in his mind. And in the other sense, he argues that affirmative action is completely inappropriate because he feels his in-group does not benefit. And I think that, bottom line, across the board, I think there's a general shoddiness in the construction of the argument on the other side. And if any anti-affirmative action person is listening to this podcast, if they've made it an hour and 10 minutes in, I would really urge you, and I mean this earnestly, I think that affirmative action is an extremely complex topic. I think it's really important to have science, to have good rhetoric behind it. It's a topic that is really meaningful to a whole heck of a lot of people, and it's a high-stakes argument. And I think that the argument is really done an injustice when ridiculous science like mismatch theory is cited basically without any consideration for what the theory actually argues. And I think that the argument is really done a disservice when you have this sort of selective cherry-picking of certain arguments depending on whether or not it benefits you or not. I really urge whomever opposes me, who thinks I'm wrong, please build a good argument and present it, because I think it's really important that if we're going to have this debate, we have a debate with two sides that are equally trying to bring the best that they have to offer. And so far, I don't think that's happening. So on that note, James just gave me the thumbs up, and we're about an hour and 10 minutes in. So I think he's about done with this topic, unless you want to weigh in the last bit. James, do you think that mismatch theory is wrong or wrong and racist? 3 seconds, go.
Wrong and racist. No. Look, just last thing on the topic. I think what's clear here is that the people who oppose affirmative action have opposed affirmative action because of a couple different things. One, they believe that the standards we have to evaluate student merit are objective. Two, they believe that African Americans fail on those measurements because they aren't intelligent. You have to kind of believe both to buy into mismatch theory, because there's an assumption being made about the nature of the teaching involved, not just the nature of the student, but also the nature of the teaching. As you start from way back here, the school can't bring you up to par. You will never be up to par because you started from way back here and you're black. Like, that's what's being argued. You have to believe both if you believe in mismatch theory as a reason for your overall disdain for affirmative action policies in higher education. I don't agree with that, and I'm not going to agree with that. I've lived a life that I would suggest very much calls into question all those assumptions. But what's also very clear is that when it comes down to it, our arguments in favor of affirmative action have to be very specific as well. I want to leave you guys with a couple of notes from a couple of different people who've argued in favor of affirmative action, because I wanted to just sort of talk about what not to do. I was reading this interesting piece on mismatch theory and Saunders' work, and I came across a couple of different responses to Sonder that were from educational philosophers. One of them, and Amy Gutman, from the president of the University of Pennsylvania, talked about the university as a sanctuary of non-repression, a place where varied mindsets would be more likely to create intellectually debatable issues. Varied here being analogous to different. So, to obtain differentiation in points of view, institutions of higher learning must search for prospects with experience and talents distinct from one another. And affirmative action is a tool for recruiting, admitting, retraining, and matriculating said students. Now, I think that's bullshit. I think that's bullshit because it assumes that black people have this overly black way of thinking that's so utterly different. It, again, in my opinion, tends to lead us to a point where the African American entity is brought into the school through affirmative action because they are offering something different to people, like the guy who plays the oboe really well, or the guy who can throw 30, 100 yards down the field. Being black isn't doing anything. It's a state of being. Just being black. How you think as a black person is completely up to you. So the notion that affirmative action is a worthwhile endeavor because black people are just naturally different and will give us different points of view than you'll find white and Asian and other like enclaves, that doesn't quite follow. Second and last one.
I disagree with you, but that's a topic for another debate.
Michelle Moses, another educational philosopher similar to Gutman, takes on the idea that affirmative action recipients should feel pride in what they bring to their institutions of higher learning, that their contributions can be found in experiences and perspectives that would not be brought from other groups. So be happy that affirmative action is bringing you in, because like the guy playing the oboe, like the guy who can play 10 people at once in chess and win every game against all of them, you can be black. That's a really hard one for me. It's an extreme and almost absurdist emphasis on the Gutman proposition, and it wants to say that we have an extra nuance that's brought. I know that my way of thinking is indelibly shaped by my experiences as an African American, but I'm not comfortable with the notion, I don't think any of us should be comfortable with the notion that college admissions officers should look for a black way of thinking, because that leaves us in classrooms where you're the only one there who looks like you, where suddenly, for the black perspective, let's turn to James. I've been that guy. I've been asked for that black perspective. I'm telling you, nothing good happens from that point on. Because as an individual who has his own intellect, I don't expect other black people to think like me, and I don't think like other black people. That being said, I definitely appreciate the time to speak about mismatch theory, and Jen, you're doing great work on reappropriate.co. So all of you should be reading reappropriate.co every day. Good stuff there. You'll learn something.
Well, I just want to end off with, I think my fundamental problem with mismatch theory is that it's scientifically shoddy. It's also extremely fatalistic. It argues that why bother going to college, because if you got, a low score on standardized tests, apparently you can never do right ever again. And that gets back to the idea that, Saunders cares about the campus environment until he doesn't. He argues that campus environment is incredibly important in shaping the success of a student, yet he simultaneously argues that the student's performance on a standardized test establishes how that student is going to do in that first year regardless of where he went, and that's based on how he analyzes his data. So I think that, as I said earlier in the podcast, my fundamental point of view is that mismatch theory is a load of bunk. And it is, as you said at the beginning of the podcast, equivalent to intelligent design. And those of you who are citing mismatch theory, I'm not saying don't cite it, but I am definitely saying that if you're going to cite it, it would do well to read it first and to reconcile the vast quantities of writing that has been written in opposition to mismatch theory by highly reputable scientists who do this for their jobs, and to also have to incorporate other aspects of the argument, like the existence of non-East or South Asian Americans in the diaspora, and to incorporate just other facts, other issues like legacy admissions. When the anti-affirmative action, anti-race conscious affirmative action debate or side of the argument is able to construct that argument, I'll be very interested, because I'm not even saying I have the right way of thinking about it. But so far I have not been convinced by the other side, and I think it's really important that if you're going to be citing science, that you have some idea about what it's about. So in the end, I hope that those of you who listened to this podcast thought that it was at least somewhat meaningful when it comes to parsing what mismatch theory is about, perhaps some of the places where it's flawed, not only scientifically, really in the nitty-gritty of it. And like I said again, James will be giving me all the things he read, and I will be lit reviewing it for us in a sort of layperson's translation of the science. But also more generically in terms of the rhetoric of mismatch theory, how there's some fundamental assumptions made by those who support mismatch theory that I think are much more assumptions than they are flat-out fact. And we need to really challenge those underlying assumptions when we're arguing against mismatch theory to really get at the meat of why this theory is so popular. So with that, I want to thank you, James, for joining us tonight for what I think is an incredibly fun and rousing episode of Reappropriate the podcast. I also want to thank the 3 viewers who streamed this podcast live with us, although you all have left now. Thank you for joining us tonight. And I also want to invite all of you who are listening to this who want to maybe download it tomorrow or save it for later listening. You can do so by subscribing to the podcast on the iTunes Store or subscribing to my YouTube channel. And you can also check this out. It will be published on the blog at reappropriate.co tomorrow sometime in the afternoon, hopefully, for your consumption. And I want you to mark your calendars for either next week or 3 weeks from now. I'm attempting to book a guest. And we will be talking about what it means to be an ally as a person of color. Really getting at, if you've read Paku Her's latest article from 18 Million Rising, she puts forward this idea of the performative allyship. And I'm really trying to get some guests to really tackle what it really means to be an ally as a person of color with other communities of color. And I think that springboards nicely from tonight's topic. So again, James, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to all of you who are listening, and I look forward to talking to you again next week.